The reason that people were so historically suspicious about love is that marriage for thousands of years had very little to do with the individual relationship between a man and a woman. And the more I study marriage, the more I'm convinced that the invention of marriage had nothing at all to do with the relationship between the man and the woman. Marriage was invented to get in-laws. It was a way of turning strangers into relatives, of making peace. That's why the word for wife in many languages means peace weaver. As societies became more stratified, marriage became a way of getting connected in-laws. And as such, it became a center of maneuvering and control and coercion and betrayal for thousands and thousands of years. The upper class used marriage to seal military alliances, to sign peace treaties, to consolidate wealth. As I said, it wasn't until the late 18th century that this new radical idea came along. Part of it was the Enlightenment, the idea that the older generation shouldn't dictate to the younger, and the state shouldn't dictate to the younger generation. And part of it were the individualistic ideas of the revolutionary era in France and America, the Declaration of Independence, with its claim that people are entitled to the pursuit of happiness, and that goes for personal relationships as well. And they ought to pursue happiness in marriage and on the basis of love. And you know what's fascinating is that immediately social conservatives of the day, defenders of what was then the traditional marriage, political and economic convenience, were absolutely horrified. They said, oh my gosh, if you make marriage about love, how are we going to get the right people to marry? You know, if my son can say, I don't love her, you know, stupid reason like that. How are we going to prevent the wrong people from marrying? Today, the debate is, well, you know, gays and lesbians are saying, well, if marriage is about love and sexual satisfaction and it no longer has to be about gender roles, why can't we have access to marriage? In the 18th century, they were afraid that poor people would want access to marriage. The other thing they were worried about is, if you say marriage is about love and mutual respect, what's going to prevent people from demanding a divorce? If the marriage does not turn out to be about that? What's going to prevent people from saying, hey, it's just as respectable to have a love child? It's no accident that children born outside of marriage were called love children through the ages. That it's just as respectable to have a love child as it is to enter a marriage that is not based on love. And what scared them more than anything was if you tell people that marriage is about love, men who expect to love their wives might start giving in to them, and then where are we going to end up? The very things that have made marriage as a relationship and as a love relationship more rewarding have made marriage as an institution less stable. And we end up with this paradox that when it works, a marriage today is fairer, more fulfilling, more intimate, more passionate, more faithful, more loving than most couples of the past would ever have dared to imagine. But if it doesn't work that way, it seems less bearable to people. And relationships that might have seemed bearable 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, just seem intolerable as our expectations have arisen. Wonderful research that's been done by John Gottman, a professor at the University of Washington in psychology, also a member of the Council on Contemporary Families. And for many, many years, he's been doing this interesting set of studies where he takes newlyweds and he puts them in this apartment overlooking Lake Union. And it's really, really nice. They get to stay there a couple days. It's, you know, sort of like a bed and breakfast, only it's wired for sound. And he's been trying to figure out whether there is a pattern of interactions that when you go back over time and you look which of these marriages divorced, which split up and which stayed together, can we look back at their interactions as newlyweds and see if there are any patterns? This is not exactly the same as predicting it. I know Malcolm Gladwell said that he could predict marriages. That's not really true. This is a retrospective thing, but he did found a very interesting retrospective pattern in differences between the marriages that stayed together and did not. And he said it was really a surprise to him because at first he thought it would have to be with these emotional, big interactions. You know, how much did they disclose to each other? How did they handle their fights? How did they communicate? He said, no. The real difference is in these totally boring, mundane interactions, like, you know, that's a good jam, pass me some more. Or, hey, look at the boat out there. And the big difference is in how people react to those mundane interactions. He said he came to think of them as bids for attention. And he coded his graduate students to code them in three different, I mean, it's hardly a fine distinction, but the negative ones are, look at the boat out there, the person responds, I'm trying to read here. That's a negative one. Oh, passage, isn't this jam good? Mm-hmm. Eaten with your mouth full, you know, that's a neutral one. And the positive ones are the ones that take it a little further. You know, look at the boat out there. Oh, wow, yeah. Oh, wow. You know, do you remember the time that you and I went sailing? Or, you know, pass the jam, it's really good jam. Yeah, you know how you like to put yogurt and jam together? We should buy this, you know. These kinds of little interactions. And they make this huge difference. And I think that it's a really important insight into the intellectual and ethical basis of things that we sometimes think of as emotional. Because really, those, when you think about it, have to do with the amount of interest and respect you have for your partner. Now, since the 1950s and 60s, I have to admit that the two best predictors of a man's satisfaction with marriage have not changed. One is how little criticism he gets, and the other is how much sex he gets. But how he avoids criticism and gets sex has changed immensely from the days when women really couldn't afford to criticize because they were economically dependent on men, legally subordinate to them, often had to put up with sex because that was part of the legal definition of a woman's role, and there was no such thing as marital rape beside it. Now it's a really different kind of situation that requires much more give and take. What are the two best predictors of a woman's satisfaction with marriage? One is the emotional connection she has. That hasn't really changed in the 60s, but a new one, just has roared up there in the last few years, is the man's contribution to housework and childcare. So does this mean that we're getting into a situation where, you know, we're going to have all these fights between men and women, and a lot of people have been, you know, very pessimistic, you know, how can we get men to do this unpleasant chore of housework, you know, or a guy I talked with in a panel, that's how can we get women to tamp down their expectations? No. There's a really win-win situation here. It turns out that the very best predictor of how little criticism a woman feels toward her husband and the very best predictor of how sexually attractive she finds her husband is how much housework and childcare he does. So I'd like to leave you with that particular lesson.